real-time storage and demand management.
Thank you very much. So the work I'm doing is supported by a project, Swiss Nanoterra S3 Grid, where the goal of this project is to build an active distribution network that will use storage in the form of pools or lakes inside the distribution network, essentially to cope with the volatility of renewables, which are, for example, solar PVs in Switzerland. I'll talk about three things, at least two and three if time permits, which have to do with storage and volatility of renewables. The first topic is based on a presentation that was given 1 year ago by Andrei Bejan on the statistical aspects of storage system that intrigued me, so we did further research on it, and I will present the results today. So the problem is in the real-time or quasi-real-time there's no market here, there's just an operator, for example, National Grid or Swiss Grid, or even a more local operator, that has both the problem of very renewable stuff, wind, for example, and has some storage, for example, a small lake or a big lake somewhere. And the operator would like to compensate the forecast errors of the renewables with the storage. We would like to, in particular, look at what are the benefits and, as we will see, say something about the performance that is as generic as possible as opposed to just optimizing a given cost objective. And we will look at the deterministic approach, that's the one by Bejan, Gibbons, and Kelly, and say a few words on how this can be extended. So first, how the system model is. This is a model without grid, so no transmission network. So Yves, please forgive me. We assume here we have essentially the problem of scheduling in advance the dispatchable production based on a forecast of the load and of the renewable production. So if we think then if we think this will be where the forecast will be for both of those things, then we need to bridge the gap, and we can bridge the gap by allowing for some production that we will dispatch, and we can also decide here to pump some water from the storage to discharge the batteries if this is batteries. Now this is the forecast. Based on the forecast, there will be a given decision for a given commitment here. Now in real time, of course, we will compensate for whatever deviation from forecast happens using the storage that we have. So in that case, we may need to use more energy from the storage than was initially planned, and the level, if this is possible, given the constraints of the storage. So that is the general framework. Now, if we do that, what can happen? Well, first, we assume that we can always compensate by using some fast ramping sources. So we've put enough reserve in the system so that we can always compensate. And this is what we'll have here. But that is something we would like to minimize, or at least to quantify. So one thing we'd like to understand is what is the amount of reserve we need when we have such a system. It can also happen that our forecasts are wrong in the sense that we are forced to spill some energy. Some of the renewables cannot be stored, for example, or we had dispatched so much energy that we cannot store everything that is spilled. In general, this is only one part of inefficiency. We can spill out energy, but there is also a loss of efficiency due to storage itself. If we store something, we assume there's a penalty. It depends on the size of the storage. If it's batteries, lead-acid batteries by customers, the inefficiency may be very large. You may lose half of the energy in a cycle. Here we assume more professional grade storage systems that are either Le Clancher type of batteries or pump hydro For large or mid-sized systems, we can assume 70 to 80% efficiency. But we do assume there is a loss. And of course, we don't want to store more than necessary because that, at the end of the day, causes a loss. The control problem is to compute how much we schedule in order to minimize two things. We want to minimize the energy waste and the use of the fast ramping. Here is an example of policy that we can call the fixed offset policy. The fixed offset policy consists in saying, well, in my forecast world, I think this is what I will need, and I decide to have a given reserve, a given offset from this. Here it's a negative reserve. It could be a positive one. And that is one policy. Whether it's good or not, that's another story. Intuition says it should not be good. But that is one possible policy. Another possible policy is to target a fixed storage level. And this is the work of Bejan, Gibbons, and Kelly that I mentioned at the beginning. Here it consists in targeting not a fixed offset in your schedule, but it looks at the stored energy. So it tries to forecast what would be the level of the storage given all our decisions. And we will take decisions. I will try as much as possible to reach a fixed level. Of course, it's never possible because of the forecast errors, so we will have a deviation from that. But this is what we try to reach. So this is another policy that we call fixed level. We have already two policies. I mean, how can we compare them? Well, we can compare them by plotting them on two axes for a given grid that has a given statistic of production. And we have two metrics. Of course, things are always better when you have a single one. We have here two things we would like to reduce as much as possible. One is the amount of fast ramping energy, and the other one is the amount of lost energy, which is either spilled or lost because we cycle many times here. If we look at, for example, the fixed offset policies, depending on the offset here the values are in percentage of the average wind power. So if we put an offset, a reserve of 200 times the wind power, or a deficit of 200 times, then we have very different performance trade-offs. Here we are being very conservative in terms of we will never spill out wind, but we will use a large amount of reserve. Here, that's the opposite that happens, and if we just balance, we'll be somewhere here. Here's an example of three policies and how they stand. Of course, they cannot be compared in a unidimensional way, but we can plot them on this plane. And here is what fixed level, for example, for this case would give. Of course, I'm cheating a bit because it looks like fixed level is less good, but those ones are, of course, at given levels. We don't know what the optimal level should be. And the question is, that we addressed here, can we do better than those two policies? Or more general, is there an optimal thing? Is there something we can say in general about those metrics? The answer is yes. There is, at least in the case of large storage. Large doesn't need to be very large. Large means 1 day of production of wind energy, for example, or order of 1 day. If the storage is large enough, then we have the following result. I can build a curve by compute, which we can call the LG curve. I mean, for every fixed offset U, I can compute a metric which is based on the distribution of the forecast error. This is a theorem here, therefore there are assumptions that invariably will not exactly be true in practice. Here we assume that the forecast error for a given forecast horizon has a given distribution, which we call capital epsilon, which is always the same every day. So stationarity of the forecast error. We don't assume that the forecast errors at different horizons are independent. We don't assume that kind of things at all. But we assume we have this distribution that is well defined and that we got from statistical analysis of data. If I have that for this distribution U, I can compute for every value of U an L and a G value. If I run all the possible values of U, I obtain a curve, which is the dotted lines here. And then, theorem, in the limit of large storage capacity, any policy, whatever, dynamic, non-dynamic, stochastic, non-stochastic, will always be above this line. So anything has to be inside this area. We cannot do better than that. And second, in the limit of large storage, we are exactly on the line, and this is achieved by having fixed offset. So very simple policies. So in some sense, we don't say what is the best policy for a given case, but we know exactly there is a line, and this line can be computed, at least numerically. If we know the statistics of the forecast errors, it can be computed and we can plot it. And this is what we did here for some example. Now this is for large capacity. For smaller capacity, we don't know whether there is a bound or not, but by dynamic programming, by Markov decision processes, we can compute, at least with similar assumption as in the theorem, an optimal solution. And if we plot it, then we do find, indeed, that, for example, if the storage capacity is 3 hours of average production, then we are with the optimal policy, which is the red curve here, we are on this curve here, which indeed seems to be, is lower bounded by the bound, because it's a bound, but is not achieved. The optimal one, the numerically optimal one, doesn't achieve it. For large, and again, large is like about 1 hour, 1 day of production of wind energy, we are on the line here. So interestingly also, the fixed storage level, which seems to make a lot of sense, are far away from this Pareto line here. So maintaining storage at fixed level is not optimal. If you have statistics on which you can rely for the forecasting errors, there can be better things in terms of reserve and efficiency, energy efficiency. There is even a more, now it's not a theorem, but we found that all the cases we studied numerically, the curves for large storage always have this this shape with a pronounced knee here, which means that now if I'm trying to optimize now for real, I want to save money of some kind, I'll probably optimize for a combination of the two criterions that I have here, the use of reserves and the energy efficiency, minimizing the loss. Then we see that probably it's a good idea to stay in that region, whatever your criterion is. So it's a non-parametric optimality that we can make, a statement that we can make here. Because if I move a lot from here, I will increase a lot the reserves without much gain from the lost energy viewpoint, and vice versa in the other. So there is really, at least when the storage is not too small, there is really an optimal operating point, which is largely independent of how you weight the different combinations. And this can be used to dimension the reserve that we need when we operate such a grid, which is, I believe, traditionally called a secondary reserve. So the capacity here, in the case we studied, which was based on data from the same data as used in Bejan, Gibbons, and Kelly, which is taken from national grid. In that case, we would need 2% of the optimal is for 2% offset of the average wind production. So this was the first analysis, first result, based on models. So tells us a few things. Now, this is model. A second thing we looked at is introducing prices here. And the starting point is, does the market provide optimal control? Now, in the previous case, I said the operator owns the storage and has the job of managing the volatility of the renewables. What if the storage is reacting to market? So it sells energy when the prices are high, and it stores energy when the prices are low. Will that work? When you talk to politicians, most of the time they say, yes, that's the only mental model in which we operate. So we ask the question, does it work? Right? It's not obvious if you pose it as an abstract problem. So that was the initial motivation. Can we rely on prices instead of doing the policy? We know from the previous results where on the curve we should be. Now, will we automatically, by the invisible hand of market, will we get to that point on the curve if we introduce a market? That's one way to see the question. Another way is to start from work that was presented by Sean Main 1 year ago to us at EPFL, which is on the impact of volatility on prices in the real-time market. So now we ask the question, well, what if we add storage that should reduce volatility? So let's combine the two things, and the first thing has the virtue of giving us an interesting model that combines demand, supply, and now storage. So here's the model. I apologize for the complexity, but I'll try to explain here. That's a model of the real-time market. So we assume there is a day-ahead market that has set up supply, GDA, and forecasted demand. And of course, we try to match the two, perhaps with a fixed offset. And then in the real time, there is a deviation from forecast, which is as small as 1.5% if we use the previous speaker's method. And there's also a deviation from forecast for the renewables, which is likely to be much larger from the numbers we know of. And then there is another term, which is the real-time adjustment of production, capital GFT, which is a control. That is the model of Cho and Main, which is the model we have if we do not have buffer storage here. Of course, there will be a market between the two. We'll see that in a minute. Now, if we add storage somewhere, there's an additional control, which is what I do with the storage. I can extract energy from the storage, or I can insert energy into the storage. To simplify things, it's very important here to keep into account that storage is not perfect. We lose some energy by storing it. And the way we do that is through this eta parameter here, where we say if U is positive, then if we extract energy, U is the energy that we can extract. When we put it into the system, we offset here, for example, 20%, which is not saying that physically we lose the energy when we extract it, but that's a way to model it here. So we have this highly nonlinear component that is added to the system that is more like a queuing system, depending we can inject or discharge, and it has limits. It has a maximum capacity, and also it cannot become empty. So it has energy capacity limits, and it also power capacity limit. We assume we cannot pump or discharge as fast as we can. So this is I would say all the actors of the system. Important, there is also friction in the control here. We assume that we cannot add production instantly, but that we have ramp up or perhaps also ramp down constraints. And this is here the equivalent in discrete time. We looked at 3 scenarios that differ on who owns the storage. In the simplest case, the storage is owned by the provider. So if you want here, this is a model of where a provider owns storage, or perhaps a dam used as storage. In that case, the market consists in having an exchange of energy over the market, and the control U is invisible to the consumers or to the distributor that serves the consumers. We assume here, this is verbatim from Cho and Main's paper, the consumer's payoff that is proportional to the energy that is actually used minus the penalty that occurs when there is a deficit of energy. I'm not assuming there is demand response here, so there is simply frustration, blackout if you want, that has a choke price here, minus the price, which has the price on the real-time market and the price on the day-ahead market in this moment. The supplier's payoff is similar, is the supplier has a production cost and cashes money from 2 markets. Here, everything, all the capital letters are assumed to be stochastic processes with of any type. We don't make specific assumptions, but we do make assumption that the deviation from forecast, the D minus gamma, is a Brownian motion, which is the simplest model that represents forecasting errors. In this context, classical definition of a dynamic competitive equilibrium would be that there is, by the invisible hand of the market, a price process and an exchange process, a quantity exchange process E, and then the controls, GU, such that both players, the consumer and the supplier, are happy with the same processes. So the consumer is trying to maximize its welfare, which is the integral of its discounted payoff. And similarly for the supplier, given constraints that may be for the supplier incorporating the friction constraints on the ramp-up G, and of course the constraints on the storage here that I gave before. If we don't have storage, we know there exists such an equilibrium by the paper of Cho and Main. What happens if we do have storage? But before getting there, let me mention the two other scenarios. Another scenario is if the storage is at the consumer. When you say consumer here, it's perhaps a market aggregator or a distributor, somebody who serves a number of end users who might own the storage. That happens, for example, Service Industriel de Lausanne, that serves us in where I live, has a little dam and uses that for compensating market fluctuations. In this case, the problem is very similar. The details vary a lot. The control now of the consumer includes the storage U, and the supplier does not. But apart from that, we can define in the same way a dynamic competitive equilibrium. The last case is if the storage operator, if the storage is operated by a standalone company that has to make profit on just running the storage, on buying or selling, depending on the price. In that case, there are different flows of exchanges. The amount of energy that is bought by consumer, that is sold by supplier, and that is sold or bought by the storage. That gives us three variables here. Apart from this additional set of variables, we have a similar definition of a dynamic competitive equilibrium. Here we assume that the storage operator doesn't have running costs, or that the running costs are independent of what happens. When you have a dam to watch, then you do that whatever you sell or you don't sell, which is only an approximation. If you have batteries get older with how you use them in a complex and hard to predict way sometimes. This is not in the model. Well, we have three scenarios here. For each of them, we ask the question, is there a dynamic market equilibrium? The answer is yes, for the three, in fact, for the three cases. And the market equilibrium is, in fact, essentially the same. Modulo the differences, the control variables are a bit different, but they are essentially the same. And this is plotting the numerical evaluation of the price process, for example, with a case without storage. So this is similar to what is in Cho and Main's paper. We find that without storage, the prices in this simplified model are either zero or the maximum value due to black hat, the choke-up price. As soon as we introduce storage, then we find that the prices with some amount of storage become smoother. And here, with a large amount of storage, the prices become much smoother, and they are very far away from the choke-up prices. And we saw also that the evolution of the amount of storage in the reservoir tends to be fairly stationary as well. Market equilibrium is one thing, but the real interesting thing is social optimality. Is the market driving us to a social optimum? In the case without storage, Cho and Main show that yes, the market equilibrium is socially optimal. Then we have the same question is asked here. Here, the social optimum consists in saying, assume I am in a well-governed ideal land where there is a social planner that plans everything. So that was what Marx believed would happen in communist countries. So this is highly ideal, and of course doesn't pretend to be a model of reality, but just a way to represent an optimization problem. So here we try to take the payoff of all the agents in all three scenarios. So we have three social optimal problems, if you want, except that with the price structures that we have, the total payoff is the same for three scenarios, and the prices disappear from the equation, so that the social optimum will be the same for all three cases and can be computed. Here is, for example, some trajectories of the social optimum. There is, it's difficult to compute in general, but we can say something about it. It's not difficult to compute, but it's difficult to give a closed form of any kind. There is a control law. For example, if we plot the reserve is defined as the generation minus the demand. If the reserve, as a function of the reserve, on the y-axis, sorry, and the storage level, then there is a control law that will tend to reduce the reserve when we are above a certain threshold and augment it when we are below the threshold. So a threshold-based policy is optimal for this case. And here is a sample path of a possible trajectory. So we see that in principle when we are here, we try to go back to the blue line. Well, we are below, we try to come back to it. But random deviations, of course, will bring us away from this ideal line where we try to be. But there's a control law that can be computed numerically for reserve as a function of storage level or storage as a function of reserve. Now, there is a social optimal that we can compute, and then there is also, similar to the case without storage, any dynamic competitive equilibrium for any of the three scenarios maximizes social welfare. We could stop here and say, yes, the invisible hand of the market works. Of course, this is a highly theoretical paper, academic, so there's a lot of hidden things. In particular, we assume here a very, very perfect market where all the players are price takers and are trying to manipulate the prices. So for every millimeter fraction of storage, they obey to the market instead of imposing prices, which might not be true, in particular if there are only a small number of large players. But still, it says that there is some hope that things could go well by controlling the storage through prices. And we see here, for example, the stationary distribution of prices when we go from zero storage, where the prices are either very small or very large, to a large amount of storage. 1 unit of storage, 1 unit of energy is, well, we take abstract units of energy here to avoid a specific statement. However, there is a catch. This is true, but only on the short term horizon. Here, what is not in this model is capacity planning, and is there an incentive for anybody to install storage? That's another question we could ask, but we did not ask. However, we can say something on a question we didn't ask. If we look at the curves, we can compute the expected social welfare, for example, on this curve, as a function of the installed storage capacity. The blue curve is the one of interest, and we see that if we have zero storage, then we have a given welfare, and then if we increase it, then we make the prices smoother, and everything is, and then we reduce the volatility of the wind, and everybody's happy, and the social welfare increases. So it's monotonic in the installed capacity, and like any buffer system, after some level, it doesn't really improve, so it saturates here, which is as you expect here. You have enough storage, putting more doesn't help. However, if we look at the expected welfare of, for example, a standalone operator, then we see this blue curve here. As the storage increases, if you have zero storage, you don't make any money, so your welfare is not good. If you increase it, you make more money, but then it decreases. It goes back to zero. And why it decreases is because the prices go down. There's less volatility. The thing you're selling, remember, a storage operator lives of the difference between high price and low prices. So at some point here, we see that there is a maximum. And if we compare the two, we see the maximum for those curves is for 1 unit of energy. At 1 unit of energy, we're very far away from the optimum. So now if we talk of capacity planning, and it would be in an ideal world where everything is rational and based on our papers, then the operators would say, well, I will install that amount of storage, and therefore the social welfare will be half of what it could be in the ideal world. So in other words, there is not really an incentive to install storage. So in fact, if we look in detail, or at least numerically for the examples we have, if we look at it for the standalone operator as well as for the consumer side, there is an incentive to underdimension the storage. If the consumer is if the storage is on the provider's problem, then the two incentives are aligned. We can also easily, because we have a model that's tractable, we can easily look at scaling laws, which are of interest if we believe that the new regulation will increase the amount of renewables. So we ask the question, how does all of this move when we scale things? Then if we scale, the sigma is the volatility parameter. It's the parameter of the forecast error of the Brownian motion. Now, if we increase, we have a scaling law, for the optimal storage capacity. I mean, first we see that as a function of the storage capacity, the social welfare, we very often have curves where being at the optimal matters. Sometimes it's misleading to see how does the optimal depend on a parameter. If being a bit below the optimal is still good enough, but that's not the case here. Very often, for many cases, we do need to be close to the optimal. But we see that the optimal storage capacity scales like this. This is the volatility, and this is the ramp-up constraint. So if we increase the volatility by X, and the ramp-up capacity also by X, so this will come naturally when we introduce renewables in areas that don't have renewables, and this will come at a considerable capital expense. But even if you compensate the volatility by the ramp-up capacity, you still need to increase the storage by X. So essentially, it's very bad news. The storage increases sharply as the volatility increases. And the bad news is also if you we and other people looked at the volatility when we aggregate wind, for example, on large areas, there is a small decrease in volatility, but there is not something like a central limit theorem that the wind would become deterministic because you aggregate it over a whole continent. When there is big wind in the UK, there's also a lot of wind everywhere else, and vice versa. So there's a strong correlation. So the volatility is expected to be very large. How am I standing with time? I think I have 10 minutes. Okay, then I can move to the rest. So what this suggests to us is that with a free and honest market, and those highly idealized versions, storage can be operated by prices. However, there might be enough incentive for storage operators to install the optimal storage size, which is a critical point because the capital investment for storage are very large, whether you use batteries or pump hydro. And this is to be contrasted to the fact that we, in many countries, subsidize renewables, but we don't subsidize storage. In fact, even in some countries, storage have to pay the grid tax. And so this is perhaps an alignment of incentives that should be considered. The third ingredient to compensate for the volatility is, of course, demand response. So here, I'll talk of a model of real-time demand response that we did 1 year ago. And in particular, it tries to look, at least qualitatively, at could this nightmare occur? In other words, here is, for example, in red, the loads that we expect with demand response. So I have a forecasted load, then I have a problem because the renewables have dipped. So I do demand response, I flatten the load. That's the hope when you do demand response. But could it be that we have that? So that thing gets worse, perhaps later, at a point when you would not like it. Of course, some of this is expected. I mean, if you switch off all the air conditioners in California now, of course, they will come later. Right? So you expect this rebound effect. But is it only this, or could it be worse? That's what we looked at. So we consider the same problem, a variant of the model that we had before. We have everything the same now, but now storage is replaced by demand response. And demand response here is a form of real-time demand response, which does not try to anticipate, but is simply saying, now you switch off because we want to avoid a blackout. So whenever the total supply is superior to the express demand, we assume in this, again, highly ideal model, that all the demand that cannot be satisfied is simply subject to demand response. So there's no blackout, nobody is really dissatisfied. The pool of demand response is large enough so that that can always happen. However, the demand, that is the loads that are delayed, what will happen to that? Well, they will come back sooner or later. Not entirely. If you look at things in detail, I mean, if I switch off my heater in the UK or my air conditioner in warmer places, when I switch it on again, I'm probably not using the same amount of energy as the one I've saved. Perhaps I've accepted a small variation of temperature, a degradation of quality of service. Therefore, there might be what we call some evaporation. Evaporation means some of the energy that virtually I would have needed to satisfy has evaporated. It's gone away and will never come back. And then some of it will come back. And then we use, this is a differential of the backlog here. This is simply saying it comes back at a constant rate proportional to the size of the backlog of energy here. And of course, now this adds up to the naturally occurring demand, the one that was forecast, for example. So that's the model. What do we do with this model? Well, we assume, like before, that the deviation from forecast is Brownian motion. Here we did for tractability a discrete time model, so the equivalent is a Riemann model. And then we obtain a 2D Markov chain, so that can easily be simulated at least. And the control problem, like before, is simpler. We have no storage, is for the supplier to control the amount of production, given friction constraints. We assume here also threshold policy, very similar to the reference idea. And here is a small simulation of, I would say, an optimistic case where I assume the evaporation has some value mu zero, and this is simulating a day in the real-time market. On the x-axis is the reserve, which is the amount of production that's adjusted in real time minus the demand. And on the y-axis is something invisible, which is the backlog. That's the total energy that has been subject to demand response and has not evaporated and will come back. And we see that one simulation gives that. If we do many simulations, for mu positive, we find something like this. We find some simulations where during a day nothing happens, some others where a lot of nasty thing happens. In fact, we find always that there are a probability of rare events that are large excursions into negative reserve and large backlogs. And what is, at least in this model, is that they are completely unpredictable. They may not happen one day with exactly the same initial condition, or they may happen. If they happen, they can be very small or very large. So it is just a sign of an unstable stochastic system. For example, here are two examples of days where day one, this, and day two, this has happened. Now, of course, you can try to interpret, well, this is because the sun here has been shining a lot, or there was a football match and lots of people have done that. But in our model, there's nothing of that nature. It is just the artifact, the result of the stochastic model and of its stochastic instability in some sense. This is when the evaporation is positive. Now, when you have a stochastic model that's difficult, you try to approximate it with an ordinary differential equation by taking a fluid limit, by putting the noise to zero. The ODE will give us something very stable that converges always to a unique control point. This is again the reserve on the y-axis, on the x-axis, and the amount of hidden backlog on the y-axis. So it's stable, but that's a case where the ODE method doesn't really help us understand the stochastic model. What we do see, however, is that if by bad luck we have a deviation from the stable point that gives us here, for example, there are trajectories that may lead us very far away. Now, there might be noise here also. You don't follow exactly the trajectory. So if you have bad luck, if you go to the left several times, you might end up going very far away. But eventually, you will come back. So, in fact, the system is stable when mu is positive. When mu is negative, if you would have a nasty system that, by delaying things, makes things worse. So, if I do not heat my house now, but I heat it in 6 hours later, mu negative means I will need more energy to heat it than the energy I have saved by not heating it now. We believe by simple house thermal models, this is not true. This negative evaporation could happen only if you have highly nonlinear systems, for example, like heat pumps, that operate at night versus in the day when the air is cold versus hot. So there might be cases where that happens, but normal resistive thermal systems will never have that behavior. If the evaporation is negative, then things are simpler. The backlog grows forever, and you find things that are fairly catastrophic. So in terms of stability, I said the system is unstable, but it's an interesting and intriguing stochastic model where if we do simulations, we can do many simulations and be happy the thing doesn't move much, or unhappy because it doesn't move much. If we look at the ODE, we'll say it's stable. And in fact, mathematically, we can prove it is stable in the sense of a Markov chain. However, it will qualitatively have large excursions away from from zero, from the stationary point. What this suggests about demand response? Well, demand response is very attractive as opposed to storage. I mean, what you need to install is very minimal compared to you send messages to people, switch off your lights now, switch off your heater. Everybody does it, and it's wonderful. However, it suggests that, whoops. Okay, I will continue with that images. It suggests that perhaps there is a large level of unpredictability that is input in the system due to demand response, and that goes well beyond the simple fact that if you don't cook now, you will cook in 1 hour later. It's beyond that. The small accumulated frustrations might build up without any specific deterministic reason. So what this tells us is that if we do demand response, we need to be able to observe what is this latent load, which nobody does today, as far as I understand. In our model, the nasty thing is that the Z, the total backlog, is not observable. It is things that people would like to do and could not do. If we observe it, then of course there would be other controls that could stabilize it much better than what we said. If we don't observe it, we are likely to have the scenarios I said. Voilà, I'd like to give credit to my co-authors, but my screen has disappeared. So I would like to mention that this is work I did with Nicolas Gast, Alexandre Coutier, and Dan Thomasin. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Yes, sure.
One suggestion is that the stability issue can also be addressed by controlling the sort of regulation signal going to appliances. So if you restrict, really carefully restrict it so it's zero mean for HVAC, and the frequency band is limited. So you make sure that the variability induced in take air conditioning is restricted to a bandwidth under, so that so then you'll stabilize the system just because you constrain. You're not subject to the buildings of nature.
Yes.
It's harder to analyze, but I think that's a way. That's also a way to avoid that issue of at least you need less. It's easier to predict the frustrated demand and so forth if you restrict the regulation signal too much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I really like your term of frustrated demand. What if we were to, I'd say, make this demand less frustrated by sending a day-ahead price signal first, so that they can maybe, I'd say, allocate tasks, and then you have this layer of real-time pricing.
Yes.
I mean, what do you think? Have you tried, or do you have an
it's not in the model. So the model is really the real-time response to real-time demand response control. So the day ahead will change things dramatically.
But you would believe that erase a potential instability, or that just dampens?
I don't know.
You don't know?
So you mentioned that you left out transmission, and transmission looks very separate. But I wonder, is it all that separate? Because to some extent...
No, I didn't say it's separate.
Yeah, well...
I just say we left it because we left it. But I agree it's important.
Yeah, to some extent what storage is doing is shifting demand from one place to another.
In time.
In time. And so, for example, the point you made about the incentive for the storage operator would be to undersupply storage, because it constrains the amount of storage and helps keep the price different. And I suppose earlier today, one of the earlier talks described the rationale for having a competitive market in generation and a regulated market for the transmission network, because that was more of a natural monopoly. So I just wonder where storage would fit naturally. Does it fit naturally as a sort of form of transmission, or subject to other natural regulatory constraints for storage, those that go with transmission rather than generation?
I think that's exactly the important question, but I have the impression storage is just another thing. It's not transmission, it's not generation, it's not load. It's a fourth dimension that we should treat as such, and is not treated as such. I mean, most places today, a storage operator is somebody that is like if you would be burning, you have, I don't know, a heating system that sometimes generates electricity, sometimes uses it, whether you're storing or not is the same. And in fact, if policies want to promote the use of renewables, they should somehow in the radar screen have also the renewables without storage don't work. So we need storage, and perhaps it's a new thing also for regulation and for policy. That's the impression I have.
Can I just comment on that? I mean, all of this is the feedback loop. You know, it's like this is what stabilizes the grid, and reliability is everything. And so it seems that all of the balancing reserves, which storage is included, is maybe only a few percentage of the total energy, but it's the feedback loop like the ailerons in an airplane, and so it should be sort of treated totally different than because it's the whole basis of reliability, having this resource available and having it reliable. So, that's why you would never use price signals, for example. Just like you wouldn't put price signals on ailerons in an airplane. I think it's clearly a very different goal to stabilize the grid. Does anyone disagree with that? No, okay.
Doesn't it depend on the amount of storage that you're talking about? I mean, storage has a role to play in stabilizing, in saving between, say, day and night.
It depends on how
Which you could
right. And in the context of this talk is, regulation. These are like balancing reserves. And, if you're talking about, like a day of no sunshine and no wind, that's a different.
But something in elementary economics, I'm just not understanding. I mean, whenever you've got anything that's capital intensive, you open it up to competition, then if enough people compete, the marginal costs are relatively low, then because of the competition, no one's going to be making any money to speak of at the margin, so there is no incentive to provide these facilities in the first place. And we've
Exactly. That's
the same thing in telecommunications. I mean, that's your thing. The price coming down as the amount of storage went up. If they're only making money to begin with because of the sort of monopoly effect, which repaid their capital investment. It was the same thing exactly in telecommunications networks. Why don't more operators go out of business because it's so expensive to set up and so cheap to run? And it's only because they're forever being creative and fooling their customers that they keep going. So I just don't understand the market.
Question?
I just wanted to finish. I had a question actually, but I think here actually some of the system operators are considering that the investments are quite high, and if their investments to be made, they would then own and operate the storage. That would be natural.
Suppose there are a lot of them, so they're competing with each other and they drive each other's prices down.
No, but here, the unique system operator.
If it's,
So it's
if it's the system operator, yes,
Yeah.
if you've got that monopoly, then it's
Yeah.
all right.
And actually, it would prevent also maybe this undersizing, because they would use pure reliability-based analysis, and they would maybe tend to oversize. Actually, you never know. But anyway, no, I wanted to ask you something about, because one of the thing you do is you say it's a Brownian motion, and also for your first part, you also assume somehow that the stochastic process is stationary. I mean, even like the distribution is the same.
No, it's not stationary. It is that for a given time, you can look at the error. So the errors are non-stationary. You do the forecasting 15 minutes ahead, half an hour ahead. The variability of this forecast will increase.
Yes.
So that's what so what we assume is stationary is if I do the forecast now for the rest of the day, have a given distribution of error, which is not one random variable, but a given process. Tomorrow, when I will do the forecast for the day after, I will have the same stochastic nature for the same law for the
Okay,
process.
sorry, so I miss...
But I'm not
said
assuming that
that-
the
yeah.
forecast errors are independent within a given...
No, but what would be the impact somehow of challenging these assumptions?
So this assumption is necessary for a theorem to hold.
Yeah.
But all the simulations we showed are based on number crunching the data
Oh, it's really...
that we have from National Grid. So they are not the assumption that the points, the stars and the triangles
Yeah.
are based on real data. And we see that this assumption that they're not exactly on the curve, even so there is a very small difference, which probably has to do with the non-stationarity in reality, but is very minimal.
And for the last part, when production minus demand errors is a Brownian motion,
Mhm.
what if it's a more colored noise with some asymmetric type
Well, it's
of-
very colored. It means your prevision was not good.
Yeah, well, yeah. Happens quite a lot.
Yeah, so we assume the best prediction you can do after
Okay.
post-processing. We looked at that in the papers I give as references. We can take the weather forecasts or the wind production forecasts that are essentially weather forecasts filtered by the peculiarities of the machines, but we can refine them to make them true the best possible predictors. For example, if you have a forecast error now, then you can correct the forecast that was done yesterday for an hour later based on the error you've observed now. If we do that, we reduce by a few percent the forecast error, but not dramatically. We go from 20% to 17%, for example. So it doesn't fundamentally change the...
Yeah, so overall you believe this assumption is acceptable and...
Oh, it's an assumption. We have a theorem that says there is somewhere a limit curve. It's a capacity theorem, if you want. If you want to reduce both the gas turbines you need to compensate for the fluctuations of wind and avoid energy inefficiencies by spilling out wind or unnecessarily cycling your storage, there's a physical limit that you can do. How you get this curve depends on those assumptions, but that's where those assumptions are needed.
Any other questions? Yes.
Just, this might be irrelevant, so please tell me to shut up if it is. But you talk a lot about forecast errors and using the storage to compensate for forecast errors. Would it be the same kind of picture if you're using a larger storage mechanism to compensate for variability rather than for errors in the forecast? Is the picture still the same, or how can?
No, there would be the day-ahead market, right, which is not studied here. That's another problem. I mean, I can decide to compensate for a planned shortage of something in 3 days by planning that I will empty my dam in the Alps. That's something which is not in our model. So we're really talking of an operator that is at the time scale of the secondary reserve and tries to reduce the secondary reserve by using storage. The other one is a very interesting problem, but we have not studied it.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed.